Notsando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Let's tell you about this. The Draft Companies Amendment Bill 2021 is being published this October for a period of 30 days for commentary. One of the major changes is the requirements for listed entities and state-owned entities to provide remuneration reports that inter alia clearly lays out entities' remuneration policies and all remuneration received by the entity's principal management. The new requirement further states that this report disclose to the fullest extent possible the entire suite of remuneration earned by the highest paid employee of the entity. The requirement further extends to include the same disclosure requirement as the CEO, but instead to the lowest paid employee of the entity. To talk a little bit more about this, Milton Segal is SAICA's Senior Executive for Corporate Reporting. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So, how much does this change the level playing field? Because we also know that people have clauses, loopholes to ensure that they don't fully comply, they're not fully transparent with exactly how much a person like a CEO earns, whether it's in bonuses and other unseen, trimmings that they get in their package.
So good evening and thank you very much. And correct, I think this is a little bit of a game changer. This draft proposal, if mandated, will now require the compulsory disclosure of the directors, as you've mentioned, their full suite of remuneration, including any other fringe benefits or share options or facilities that they may have, etc. And as you've stated, it specifically requires the full disclosure of that of the highest earning employee of the entity, which would presumably be the CEO. So there's nowhere to hide in that regard.
So I want to talk about whether overexposure could have the exact opposite effect of what is being intended, because for many years, those of us who've been sitting on the sidelines talking about the gross inequality in this country have heard, especially from unions, that if they knew the figures, then that would change the picture altogether. They would hold people accountable.
So that's very true. And I think what makes that more prevalent with these draft requirements is the same disclosure that's required for the CEO is now required for the lowest earning employee of the entity. So we will see, in fact, a direct comparison between what the top earner earns and what the lowest earner earns. So the gap, the wage gap, the disparity between the lowest earner and the highest earner will be there for public view. And that applies to both public interest entities, state-owned entities, as well as list entities. So that does then give a basis for a lack of a better word, for comparison. And again, it also requires the average remuneration of directors to be disclosed, as well as the average of the top 5% of the salaried employees' earnings, as well as the bottom 5% of the salaries of the average employees' earnings. So that analysis, again, gives us further way to see, to measure the success of the principal officers, the directors, the executives of the entity, and to assess the value that they're creating, and to an extent, is that value being transferred to stakeholders, one of which primarily being employees?
So I'm glad you speak about the term of value, because we want to know what the value to the end users will be of this change to the law, and what the impact will be on staff morale as well.
So I think that's an interesting one, and I think it requires some consideration. From a positive perspective, perhaps the lower paid employees could see that as a launch pad and as a career path and as something to aim to achieve towards, to one day become the CEO and to earn the big number, or certainly the biggest number within the entity. We just wonder about what impact that may have from a negative perspective, and what are the potential unintended consequences of that. Could that in fact produce employee apathy? Could it produce resentment? Could it sort of lead to some type of employee revolt or rebellion thereon? So the consequences of this type of disclosure is interesting. And to the point of, could there be over-disclosure? I think payroll and remuneration is always one of those very sensitive items that need to be dealt with due care. The same as if an entity's strategy or an entity's secret formula or entity's database, there would be cautious to disclose those type of issues at the public area, and therefore the context of the remuneration needs to be carefully considered. I mean, the point being, we'd encourage our employees to earn as much as physically possible, specifically in the public interest. However, we also want to encourage the top executives and the CEO to be attracted to the positions, to ensure that we retain top quality leadership with skills, leadership with knowledge and experience, the type of leadership that could grow the entity, that could produce the economic benefits, to take the entity to the next level, to provide the required service to the community, and to continue to produce an entity that's sustainable, that can continue to support and employ entities without becoming a burden to a taxpayer, for example.
So, Milton, here's something that I'd like to touch on. I mean, rather continue with that you've touched on it, and it's about how cosmetic all of this is, because it's often said those at the top end of the scale carry the greatest risk in terms of accountability to stakeholders and shareholders. But when we talk about consequence management, we see that it's often those at the lower rung of the scale who end up getting the chop. So this transparency, is it going to incentivize them to strive to climb the corporate ladder?
Well, I mean, it certainly will show what's available at the top of the corporate ladder and incentivize staff to grow and to get to that level. In terms of the value and the accountability, I do think it will help in achieving the recognition of the types of remuneration that top management earn, and does then, perceive and ask questions not only by staff, but the public out there as to what value is being added and is the governance at the appropriate level thereon. So it could be seen as a positive and an incentive, but as mentioned, caution just needs to be considered in this regard as well, and to the context, because we don't want to lose the best people within our organization. At the same time, we want to encourage those people lower down the ladder or lower down the chain to strive to do their best to ultimately try achieve greatness and perhaps being future CEOs.
All right. Thank you so much, Milton Segal, SAICA Senior Executive for Corporate Reporting. And now we'll take a look at your sports news. Simon is in the studio with us. Simon.